Hello, Assalamu alaikum and peace upon you all. I'm your co-host of the Architecture Shelf, Nylda, a Part 1 architectural graduate and the voice behind the Architectural Experiment blog, along with Emily, a fantastic Level 6 architectural apprentice, where we share our discussions about architecture and design as we explore what it means to be in the architecture industry as young professionals. We got the chance of a Q&A with Sarah Lebner, the award-winning principal architect at Lighthouse Architecture and Science, but also behind my first archi job and the author of the book 101 Things I Didn't Learn in Architecture School and Wish I'd Known Before My First Job, our first book in the launch of the Architect's Shelf. We had a great discussion on various aspects of the book, from architecture education, what is sustainability, and advice to those seeking work during these challenging times, especially as new graduates. It was great to have Sarah share her great wisdom and time as a practicing architect in this discussion, but where she also shares on her Instagram page my first archi job and on her website myfirstarchitecturejob.com, where she helps to bridge the gap for graduates and professionals alike all over the world. I hope you enjoy listening to this. To the listeners, so welcome to the first sort of guest appearance of our first book author, Sarah Lebner, and so we've decided to take on her book 101 Things I Didn't Learn in Architecture School and Wish I'd Known Before. So we decided to pick this book because it's one of those books that I think all graduates can learn from as we sort of dive into a career that is in architecture, although it's aimed initially for Australian architects or like the Australian industry that is in architecture. We found some very useful takeaways that I think students, graduates, and professionals alike can take on and sort of progress and use to, I guess, constantly be reminded that you are a constant student, whether you're at any of those stages of your career. So I'm Nylda. I have the page, The Architectural Experiment, where I sort of dive into some of the experiences of architecture that I've had and some things I'm learning as I'm sort of progressing into my journey of architecture. And so, yeah, Emily, do you want to kind of just share your sort of...
Yeah. So I'm Emily, and I'm what's called a level 6 architectural assistant apprentice at an architecture firm based in London called Alford Hall Monaghan Morris. I mean, we also have offices elsewhere, but I'm particularly in London. And I'm currently in my second year of my bachelor's at London South Bank University doing architecture. So I'm doing a kind of hybrid thing where I go to university 1 day a week and then 4 days a week I'm at practice. So it's quite a nice way, I guess, of incorporating things that I otherwise wouldn't learn in architecture school, which kind of segues into my kind of first kind of question, where I was wondering, so at the end of the whole book, I mean, this is the end, but you talk about how you shouldn't really take what you learn at university for granted, and that you should actually value, there's a lot of value in it, rightly so. And I was wondering, I mean, the other side of that, if you were to design your own kind of education framework for architecture, what sort of things would you include? Whether that be topics that you think aren't really taught at university that should be taught at university, or should it be a hybrid university work or solely at work? Like, what do you think?
That's a really great question, and I'll start by saying hello to everyone watching, and thank you guys for having me. And this might be an odd thing for those not in Australia, but I just wanted to say that I'm based in Canberra today, which is Ngunnawal country, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. Not sure if you guys have ever heard that in the UK. That's quite a common thing that we do. So that's a really great question, and actually something I have been pondering a lot, because a lot of people, when they first see the book, assume that I've written it as a criticism of university education in Australia, which I haven't necessarily done. I've really since had time to reflect. There's just so much we need to learn, to become an architect. It would be impossible to pack all of that into 5 years at university. And that's why pretty much universally around the world, you do your university years, and then there's some kind of experience requirement that is then tested. In Australia, it's tested by exam and interview law. I think it's similar in the UK. And that's really your second part of your learning to get you to be a registered architect. So, you know, a lot of people are really critical of that and saying, well, I didn't learn everything I needed to know to be in the industry, but it's also, I think we need to say, well, hang on, it explicitly says as part of the process that you won't learn everything that you need. There's this other process, and it makes more sense to learn a lot of that stuff on the job. You can imagine trying to cover the depth, the variation between residential and construction and getting everyone on site enough would just be huge. I'm not even sure how you would begin to approach a university course that covered everything to sort of leave with registration. Having said that, of course, there's things that I would change, and I love you framed it as what would I do if I was designing my own course? The first thing that jumped to mind is there's a pattern in Australia at the moment that subjects are quite isolated. And if there's one thing I've learnt from practice is that collaboration is just really key to unlocking so much knowledge and value. And I think our generation is particularly collaborative. So I'd like to see more of that at university. You know, they always struggle with, you've got design studio, and then you've got tech, and then you've got sustainability. And there's often this line about how they're all integrated, but they're not at the end of the day. And I think there's a real opportunity there to genuinely get them integrated. As you mentioned, I do say, you know, don't underestimate all the things you learn. It's really common in those first few years when you're doing that more abstract problem solving thinking to be sort of churning at the bit to learn more practical and technical things. I know I was. I just wanted to know all the practical stuff. But in hindsight, that learning is such a core value of what we need to be excellent architects. Once you progress beyond those first few years where you're perhaps just drafting and learning the basics, and you get into bigger problem solving, because architects are really just expertly trained problem solvers, in my opinion. That's where all that abstract thinking really comes into play. And it's also necessary for you to have a series of design studios under teachers that all approach things differently. It's inevitable that some you won't really get or get along with, but that variation is important so that each person can find and connect with someone who has an approach that that they respect and can apply and can learn from. So that's probably it in 2 cents. The big thing I've been thinking about, actually more than changing the university course necessarily, is, and obviously what I've been actioning as part of the book and my first architecture job and my membership platform, is actually, I think we need more help in those few years after education. So I'm a little bit concerned that those sort of critical practical years often happen in isolation with little support, where you're only exposed to one firm's way of doing things. That firm might be outdated on some things, and that's where I think there's a real opportunity to have some kind of hybrid learning thing where you can expose yourself to ways other people are doing things in a really efficient way. You know, you don't have to work at 4 different firms for 3 years to see a breadth of practice.
I find that really interesting because so going back to what you said about merging different like schools of thought in architecture school, and like learning from people in like maybe doing technology, or I I really feel like I'm really passionate about interdisciplinary ways of thinking, and I feel like at Central St Martin's they do this quite well, because I know, so that's an art school, an architecture school in London. They actively have the architecture students collaborating with people in ceramics, people in fashion. I think they really encourage that collaboration, and I've been doing this outside of work and school, where I've been, for example, I'm last year I was part of an interdisciplinary team called so it's Refabricate. It was a waste reuse challenge, and they combined, they put together young architects, young craftsmen, young textile designers, people from all different backgrounds, and they got them together to solve a problem in a particular material. So my material was textiles, and it was just incredible because I was collaborating with people who've just graduated from the Royal College of Art. I mean, I was actually in my first year. I think everyone thought I was older because everyone else was like, had graduated. But because I had a bit of professional experience, I could join. So I feel like that more initiatives like that, where you collaborate with people outside that architecture bubble, is super useful. And I think that's the mode of thinking we're going towards. Yeah, and another thing, so I understand, so here in the UK, the pathway is 3 years of architecture school, and so this is the normal route, university route, 1 year out in practice, and then 2 years doing a master's, and then another year in practice, and then my route's like 4 years in doing degree work hybrid, plus 3 years and a bit. So that's the kind of difference between the two. In Australia, am I correct in thinking it's 5 years and then you do your work?
Yeah. I can clarify that. I'm just going to switch to my other internet. So if you lose me, that's what's happened. But automatically, I should have a better. Yeah, it worked. So firstly, to briefly touch on your collaboration comment, absolutely, I've really changed my thinking about that over the years. I used to want to strive to know it all, but now I want to strive to be connected to the networks that allow me to access it all. And it's a much more efficient and productive way of learning. In our firm, we're multidisciplinary with building scientists. And, when I first started, I thought that maybe that would mean I would lose that knowledge, but it's the complete opposite. You know so much about it without doing that work yourself. And we truly do collaborate. So I think that's a really good point. In Australia, I mean, I think it probably ends up similar to yours in the end, but it's a 3-year bachelor degree. In some universities, I think you have to do work experience in your year out. The one I did, you don't have to. You can go straight through and do the master's. And then it's at least 2 years working. Afterwards, you have to do a logbook and hit all of these different criteria. So some people take a bit longer to meet all of the experience. And I understand, I think one of the differences between the UK and Australia, from what I've heard, although Emily, what you're doing sounds really interesting, is that not many students work during their studies in the UK, is what I had heard. Whereas the majority of students in Australia during good economic times are probably working during their masters. So they're still getting that hybrid approach to learning.
By working, do you mean working in practice or working a normal job?
Yeah, part-time.
Yeah, part-time, yes. So there are, for example, within my own apprenticeship cohort, so at the university I go to, I attend classes with other apprentices from different practices, so like big and small, which is really nice. And I think there are a few doing part-time. And I mean, there's even a variation within the apprenticeship itself. Like other universities do, rather than 1 day a week, they do week-long intensives at the university,
right?
Like once a term. So there are various modes of even doing the apprenticeship itself.
Yeah.
So there is this year in practice, but it's not compulsory. You can just go straight to masters.
Right. Yeah.
You.
That's what you can do here. I guess you could kind of do a do it yourself version of what you're doing here. So I have had friends who have, say, worked since second or third year, and have just spread out their studies. I did that in my master's, so you can sort of spread your workload over 3 trimesters rather than 2 semesters. So I worked 3 days a week and studied and still got my master's done in 2 years.
Yeah, now I remember, I think someone at my own practice is doing something similar to that, a kind of do-it-yourself version.
Yeah. But I love that there's a more facilitated version. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I think, so in the UK at the moment, there are more universities doing level 7, so that's the masters rather than level 6, which is the bachelor's. So currently, at the moment, it's only London South Bank University in London and Portsmouth, which is just south of that. So not too many. So like there are a few apprentices within my own within the cohort at university who come from like really far away from like Durham, from like Suffolk or Bristol. So they actually have to commute properly in to be there on those days. So that's the side of things I think needs to improve, because I feel like the practice appetite is there. We just need more universities to be on board, and it's slowly growing. Yeah,
that's a really fascinating model. I'll have to think about that one. And yeah.
I mean, oh, sorry, go on. Yeah.
I was going to say To Scale, I think it was To Scale blog, did a great post recently. They sort of graphed all of the pathways to registration depending on all the countries around the world. That was really interesting and a really easy graphical way to see it.
I was just going to touch upon, like, I understand through the traditional of just studying first rather than sort of the hybrid, you can still do sort of part-time, but I think some students, because they want the full, I guess, the uni experience, that sometimes they do sort of do it on their own. But I think it's they come out very tired, very sort of, it's a very packed, because I feel like the course itself, 5 days a week, more or less, is quite intense. And so I do know some people who ended up actually just to kind of support themselves because there was no other way, especially when you go into university that's sort of in the city. It is very sort of full on, but there is sort of, you mentioned sort of the year out, whether or not sort of we have to work. I think there is that option. It's more like it's not frowned upon, but I guess it's encouraged a lot by sort of the master's sort of courses to go into a practice and work for at least a year, because that's sort of, you need to qualify, you would need 24 months overall to be able to kind of progress throughout the different sort of accreditations. So it's encouraged that you would do something outside of sort of the degree prior to sort of doing a master's. Just, I guess, I personally feel like sort of on the job hunt for myself personally, it has been a bit difficult with sort of like the COVID situation. So having to kind of play with my cards and what I do have. And so, I think it just encourages you to kind of put your design skills elsewhere and kind of really, assess your own experience of architecture, because you're kind of, in the beginning, you're sort of learning the tools of the trade, I guess. And then you kind of mature in your own sort of understanding of what kind of architecture you want to do, or what architecture you don't want to do, which is sort of where we kind of dived into. We were very passionate about sort of sustainability, because it was one of those things that it's like, I personally shy away from talking because I don't know enough And I feel like there's so much to talk about that. As a graduate, where do I kind of put my foot and say, do I work for a practice that will teach me what it means to be a sustainable architect, or to do sustainable architecture? Or do I have to do the educating and being, you know, on the other side, where I have to sort of really get myself involved and educate myself in order to educate a practice? And so we were kind of in this sort of debate as to how would sort of someone who's starting out in their career and who has an interest, because we were really interested to hear that the practice that you sort of you work in, you have this interdisciplinary or this multidisciplinary approach, which is sort of very different from it, like the practices, sort of like the big practices that we kind of hear, that I guess you don't hear it sort of talked about as much. And I think we're really interested in sort of having that involvement of sort of like a multifaceted experience of architecture. But at the beginning, how can you essentially get involved and really educate yourself and get the education that you need in order to make an informed understanding of what it is? So I know this is sort of a big
it's a great question, and yeah, obviously an area I'm very passionate and fairly informed about. In an ideal world, a sustainable architecture wouldn't be this separate thing, right? It would just be good architecture is sustainable, but that's definitely not the reality around the world. And my experience is that sustainability is still quite poorly integrated into university studies. And that is definitely one thing that should be far better taught, in my experience. There used to be quite a good subject that I tutored here at my university that did just focus on environmentally sustainable design, but it's now been integrated into Design Studio, I think, which essentially means a lot of it's disappeared. One of the best exercises, one of the years that we ran that course to introduce students to sustainability, and it's something that you can do yourself, is to study all of the different rating systems, both voluntary and compulsory. Just wrapping your head around them gives a really broad overview of all the different facets of environmentally sustainable design. Yeah, I know, and obviously there's differences between residential and construction. So anyone who's looking for a starting point, I would say start by looking at them. There's everything from Living Building Challenge is probably the most stringent. I think it's come out of America, and it's good in terms of thinking about really holistic. So it covers everything from embodied energy to whether a project is beautiful, because what's the point in doing things if they're not going to be beautiful and stay around and be valued? And then you've got, so the sphere we work in, we work more with energy efficiency as the focus in terms of the science and evidence that we used. And then we bring that holistic thinking into it in terms of things like building smaller homes or flexible homes or embodied energy. So in Australia, we have a mostly nationally adopted system called NatHERS, and it uses climate data from the last 30 years from our Bureau of Meteorology across 69 climate zones. So the biggest challenge in Australia is we're fairly big and we have a lot of very different climates, from where it snows half of winter to very tropical. So it simulates a house depending on its location and orientation, based on that data from the last 30 years. So we're able to use that, and plenty of other firms will use that as well. So there's all these consultants that do it. Unfortunately, a lot of the housing industry uses it as a checkbox at the end of a project just to get their minimum star rating, whereas we're really using it to inform and drive how we approach things. And then the science team are also focusing on other things like condensation and other big things. Another one that comes up a lot at the moment is passive house. So as opposed to solar passive. I'm sure it's got a big holding in the UK. It's gaining some grip in Australia. It's a similar approach to what we use, but our evidence and data shows us that in our climate we can achieve really essentially the same results in terms of comfort level and energy use of a house without going to the level of very extreme air tightness that passive house requires, and sort of a few of the unconventional and more expensive construction techniques. However, I suspect that in many parts of Europe, it actually makes really great sense and is probably more in line with how the standard construction industry is already working. You know, I see these details. I follow Building Science Fight Club from America and see the way they build in America, particularly North America, and it just makes us look like we're building tents over here in Australia. So that can be another tricky thing, you know, where do you get your information from? So start with the rating systems. And then I would say look for evidence. So one of my real pet hates is that a lot of the sustainability industry is based on theory, and you don't see a lot of follow-up publication of actual performance and actual cost. It is hard to publish cost of projects because obviously that can be sort of very confidential information. But you know, there's a magazine in Australia called Sanctuary that does little profiles on projects, and at the end it always says sort of what was included and how they approached it and what the project cost was. So you can follow evidence. There's no excuse these days not to have the evidence on that kind of thing, and that's where you can be a bit critical. So it's another point that I make in the book. You really do, as a young architect, need to be critical as you are learning sustainability. I've certainly changed my tact over the years in which sort of things I've been prioritizing or which school of thought I've been following. So, you know, by all means, learn about one of them and get a bit obsessed with that, but keep an open mind because something might come along. You might realize something's actually better. And really remember as a young architect that we're the generation leading this, and a lot of older architects are actually very poorly educated on this. So take everything you're told with a grain of salt. Seek that evidence that backs it up. That was a very long-winded answer.
No, that was really good, because I'm looking into this like literally like right now. Like yesterday, I was looking at the Living Building Challenge. So like only recently I've discovered that it's a thing, just from because I was listening to a talk by Michael Pollan, who did the Eden Project and it's in charge of exploration architecture.
Mm-hmm.
And he brought up this Living Building Challenge, and I was like, well, I'll have to learn more about this. So they have quite a few resources on their site, which is super useful, and they've got a few courses on there, although they are they're paid courses. So I think like the minimum is like $60, and then upwards of like hundreds of dollars.
Okay.
So that's to get the 20 credits to be like accredited as someone who knows about the living build. This is from by the Living Institute, as I understand it. So I did get the zero carbon one, which was like like $60-$50 around there, and I found that super useful. But I have the privilege of being an apprentice, and I'm being paid, and I'm not in debt. So that's from my end of things. And I know that the vast majority of people, with the apprenticeship being so new, are doing the degree route. So I was wondering if you knew of any free resources to learn about these legislations. So I know on their websites, it's often they've got a bunch of information, but I was wondering if you knew of any particular cool free things that you knew.
Yeah, I don't. And my goal this year is to make one myself. Actually, it won't be free, but hopefully an affordable way to learn about sustainability. So please follow me. And and in our membership platform, which is primarily for Australian students. But again, if you got something out of the book, you'd probably get something out of the membership. We do dive into it a little bit, depending on the different topics of the quarters. There are so many wonderful free places to learn. Like I mentioned over here, we have a really great, I think they're non-for-profit organisation called Renew, and they publish a magazine called Sanctuary that actually has really good information and articles on it. So, generally I think probably as a student, subscribing to sustainable focused magazines, and that can be a good way to weed through all of the noise on the internet, because there's a lot of inaccurate and distracting things on the internet. I'm sure there's some wonderful YouTube channels about it. I'm really aware that there's this whole world of wonderful information on YouTube that I don't currently engage with. I think as you mentioned, going on the website for each of the platforms, they should have reasonable information available freely to promote what they're doing. Livable housing is certainly I think that's a good one to start with, because of how broad and how sort of deep they dive into everything. Passive house is probably, so the passive house standard, not solar passive. Passive house is probably good in starting to think of things from that scientific point of view. And, my only warning there is to just think about what level you're taking that to, depending on your climate. And I should say, different firms have different focuses. So our firm's focus is very much trying to create solutions in that more affordable mainstream market. The reason we would never do a livable house, I'm not sure what they're called when they're qualified, the livable one, is because it is really next level. You're looking at a bigger budget and a really motivated client to get to go into that one. And I'd love to do one day, but it's just not where we're operating. And then the commercial ones are also interesting to look at as well. So we've got Green Star, which is really big in Australia, and I think it's similar to your LEAD programs. And they're interesting because they start to look at things like off-gassing and VOCs and commercial materials. And so I'm sorry I don't have a good answer on the simple courses to do, other than just try and find credible resources. And perhaps that's another good point. When you're starting out, don't get all your information from one approach or source. So if you can find a good credible magazine or journal that's delivering you a range of things, it will help you have more robust knowledge, because there's not one solution to everything we know as architects. And I think in today's age, we always want to know what's the right way and what's the best way, and there's simply not an answer to that. Everyone and every rating system that's working in the sustainability space is doing something brilliant, and they've all got something to offer, and you can sort of cherry pick them for your knowledge, and then apply them to whatever situation you're working in.
Yeah, I mean,
brilliant.
I think, that's so much more than what we.
Yeah, that was really, really good.
And same for those terms, Emily. You mentioned before we started recording. How do you start learning all the words and things? Just read and get to know projects, and you'll pick it up. It's the same as planning terms. Oh my God, it's just, I'm still learning them all in Australia, and in Canberra, where I am, which is the capital, which has its own different legal framework. It's just death by acronyms. And they change all the acronyms every time government changes. So, that's life. Just learn, and don't be afraid to ask. please, as students and graduates, just ask if you don't know something. As I say in the book, you'll either get an answer or the other person's not worth your time, because who wouldn't want to help, a student or graduate who's thirsty to learn?
Yeah, like constantly, because I have like daily catch-ups at my work, and whenever there's like an acronym that I have no idea what it is, I look it up, and then if that's the really useful thing of these online meetings as well, because when you're in a meeting, you can't exactly take out your phone and look up, like you can't, it's a bit rude, you can't take out your phone. So here you can just be like sneakily like, okay, okay, that's the thing. That. Okay, awesome, I get it. Like it's
remembering
really
people's
amazing.
names.
Yeah,
not very good at names, and I've really loved that on Zoom everyone's got a little name tag.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's so true. And then you get experienced. I'm at the point where I've forgotten what half the acronyms stand for. I know what they mean, but I can't actually tell you what they stand for anymore.
Yeah, true. I mean, the main thing is the meaning, isn't it? So
yeah,
at least that's the main thing to get. Yeah,
that's right.
World of acronyms. Yeah, like within so when you were talking about earlier about having these special, you have scientists within your practice. So within our practice, we have a sustainability team, which is super useful to have in-house. Like I approach them all the time asking for information, like to better myself, and to because right now I'm doing a materials report for the project I'm working on. So I'm trying to find more sustainable, innovative materials to use in the facade. And that's been a real amazing journey to go on. It's really exciting to see all these innovations. Annoying when they're like just at like research and development stage, and they're not quite at the like mass production stage, or using it on real building, like large scale buildings. But it's always exciting to see that this is going on. So I just love this interdisciplinary nature of things, and like being able to have everything in house. How does that like discussion work with the scientists? So do they, because I can see this rise of like researching in-house in general. So for example, DRMM architects in London, they encourage people to do their own research, and Hawkins Brown, they allow people to have time off for a period. I think it's a few months to do like a research thing. I know someone did research on light, for example. I feel like that's a real cool thing to see. How does it work in your practice? How does this collaboration work?
Yeah, there's probably two layers there, and something I'm really fascinated about, because our firm doesn't really have the model of sort of the one old expert that knows everything that you can refer to. It's a story for another day, but I ended up in the principal architect position probably earlier than I was ready, and then I had two fellow recently registered colleagues, and we were forced to together we had enough knowledge to get by, and it really forced a collaborative knowledge spirit in our firm. And one of the things I'm really interested in is yes, we sort of encourage people to do different research or CPD, and we're thinking about implementing so that every person in the firm has their topic that they are sort of the firm expert on. So if you want to know about that thing, you go talk to them. They update the notes for that thing. If you learn something about that thing, you update them, so that it is we call it a hive approach of knowledge, because that, I find that a tricky thing in firms. You don't really want everyone to be reinventing the wheel. So we try to have a system of, if you go away and do CPD, continuing professional development, that you then come back and you have a little lunch and update the team. We also try to do one lunch a month with either another architect or a consultant or a trade, just to pick their brains on things. In terms of the science and how that works, and we do have this sort of other arm, they also do services advising people on retrofitting their homes as well, which really helps us with understanding real true bang for buck. So, you know, again, we're not in that space of necessarily trying the latest materials that are a bit more expensive. We do occasionally. When my boss did her own house, we tried, tested some phase change materials and things. But what we really come back to is that through using that science modeling and getting good at understanding that, and it's a solar passive approach, again with sort of milder versions of passive house, so air leakage and insulation, and then using the Australian NATHERS system to help us learn and optimize and test things. But our focus really comes back to achieving great results using standard construction materials, because we're prioritizing influencing and offering services to the broader mass market. So it's a really interesting thing, because you've got to have architects operating in this space where they're pushing boundaries and doing really top-notch things and trying new materials and making those new materials more affordable and mainstream. But we're, I guess, actively not in that space. We're trying to show that you don't have to use all these unconventional things and added on technology, that you can stick to conventional materials and construction methods and just apply them really well, which is what architects do. You know, it's our knowledge and problem solving and design considerations. And there's a really nice balance between science and architecture in our firm. It's not that science wins, it's just about being informed. So say, for example, clients have had a large west facing view. So obviously in summer in Australia, that's going to be problematic with overheating. But we can model the different window sizes. So we can say, yeah, look, this window is a bit bigger, a bit more view, but it's going to hurt your energy rating this much. And that'll roughly equate to, electricity use or feeling, like this. So clients can make an informed decision. We don't force them. It's just that we've got that process to help us answer questions like that. Another really big one is flooring. So we use exposed concrete slab because it's a very cost-effective way to get our thermal mass into our projects in Canberra in particular. Canberra is very cold in winter, but has very sunny, crisp days in winter. So it's just the perfect place for solar passive design. So, if clients then go put a carpet or timber flooring over that, it affects that, and we can tell them exactly what the effect is. So yeah, it's sort of, using the science as a tool, I think, rather than being delivered, rather than being dictated to by the science.
Wow, that's brilliant. Like I'm so excited, going back to how with these development notebooks, how each person in your practice is a kind of specialist in a particular thing. So
yeah, we haven't instigated it yet, but we're moving.
Oh, okay, we're
it.
moving. That's so exciting. That's brilliant.
Tends to be where we're going. Yeah.
Like they're walking notebooks of like particular things. That's amazing. Like,
it spreads the load as well, because it's just impossible to be that resource that knows everything and trying to keep everyone up to date. It really stresses me out as someone leading a team, to feel that responsibility. So yeah, it's a good approach.
Yeah, I mean that's just that side in particular excites me, and also the fact that you explain things in like kind of what's layman's terms, but like for clients in like in ways that, so I guess there's also that thing in sustainability where yes, you can insulate a home, and yes, but then there's also the idea of like, you know, you can just put on a jumper, I guess, or I mean, it's also, I guess, changing people's mindsets and ways of living in the first place, and I think that's quite an interesting side of things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We're really big on, so one of our taglines is smaller, smarter homes. So the number one thing you can do before you even think about any of the sustainability is just build less house. So a recent ComSec report from last year said that we're back to building the biggest new homes in the world in Australia. We tend to battle it out with America, but I think we were back on top last year. And Canberra, the city I live in, has the biggest new houses in Australia. So here in my home city, we are building the biggest new homes in the world. And then to turn around and talk about housing affordability issues and construction quality issues and sustainability issues just seems ridiculously spoilt to me. So there's a lot of psychology in it, and I think it's easy to sit around and whinge and say, oh, it's the public's fault, but we have a role as architects to turn up and join that discussion and to help people understand. So people don't know what they haven't seen, so a lot of people haven't been in a home that's well designed and is smaller. So we try really hard to open up our homes a lot and to participate in publications and public workshops and things like that. So I've forgotten where we started talking about this, but sustainability builds smaller. Absolutely, and that's where the connection between the architecture and science and that holistic thinking works really well. So we challenge people on their briefs. A lot of people come to us with a spare room in their brief that's just a dedicated room for guests. And most of them will end up combining that with their second living space. So we say to them, look, we can design this in a way, in a location that it will function well as both. It'll close off easily. And most people are really, really happy with that. And they're not spending all this money building a spare room. And I often make the point that, that might be over the life cycle of your loan, you might be paying $40,000 in Australia to have that spare room. And that's an awful lot of nights at a nice hotel for your family that are visiting.
Yeah. I mean, you got into such a depth.